Imagine you own a house. You have lived in it your whole life. Your parents raised you there. You raised your children there. And beneath the floorboards, beneath the concrete, beneath the very foundations of that house, there is gold, there is copper, there might be oil. Billions of dollars worth of it, sitting right there in the earth beneath your feet. Now imagine you wake up one morning and someone else already owns all of it. Not the house. The rights to everything under it. You did not vote on it. Nobody asked you. The deal was never on the news. There was no press conference, no debate you were ever told about. It just happened. And the government that was supposed to protect you, they signed the papers. 4 ministers, across years, and not one of them said a word about it in a way that reached ordinary people. This is not a what-if scenario. This is not a hypothetical thought experiment. This happened. It is happening right now. And the island is Jamaica. By the end of this documentary, you will know the name of the man who controls 37% of Jamaica's mineral rights. You will know how he got them, who sold them to him, who approved it, and how much he paid. You will know what those minerals may actually be worth, and you will know exactly what Jamaica's people received in return. That last part, that is the part that should make every Jamaican on this planet stop what they are doing and pay very close attention. This is Who Owns the Caribbean, Episode 1, The Gatekeeper. Jamaica is 4,244 square miles of limestone, volcanic rock, karst, valleys, and layered sedimentary earth. It is one of the most geologically complex islands in the entire Caribbean basin, and that complexity is not some academic detail in a geography textbook. It has a dollar value, a very large one. Beneath Jamaica's blue mountains, there is copper. Beneath the dense rainforest of the interior, there is bauxite, the raw material from which aluminium is made, and Jamaica has been mining and exporting bauxite since the 1950s. That one industry made Jamaica one of the most economically significant islands in the whole hemisphere during the mid-20th century. But bauxite was always just the beginning. Geologists have known for decades that Jamaica's geology holds the conditions for multiple mineral deposits: gold, copper, nickel, cobalt, and potentially, beneath the waters south of the island, something worth more than any of those combined. Somewhere beneath the waters south of Jamaica, in a stretch of seafloor known as the Walton Basin, there may be 7 billion barrels of oil. Say that number again, slowly. 7 billion barrels. At today's market prices, that works out to approximately 742 billion United States dollars. To understand what that number means in Jamaican terms, consider this. Jamaica's entire economy, every good produced, every service sold, every dollar earned across the whole country in a full year, amounts to roughly 19 billion United States dollars. So the oil that may be sitting beneath Jamaica's southern waters is worth approximately 39 times the entire Jamaican economy, 39 years of everything Jamaica produces, in one resource, sitting beneath the seafloor. Now, who holds the exclusive license to explore for it? A company with 9 employees, a company whose shares trade at less than a third of a penny. A company whose own auditors have formally warned that it may not survive. A company that, despite holding this extraordinary license for years, has never drilled a single well. We are going to come back to that company, because the story of how it got that license, and what the minister responsible did while that company held it, is one of the most remarkable chapters in modern Jamaican history. But to understand the oil story, you first need to understand the land story, because both of them trace back to the same pattern, and that pattern has a name. To understand what is happening to Jamaica's mineral wealth, you need to understand the Stewart family. Not because this is a simple story with simple villains, it is not, but because power in a small country does not work the way power works in a large one. In a country of 3 million people, influence concentrates, connections multiply, and the line between legitimate business success and structural advantage becomes very difficult to see clearly from the outside. Butch Stewart was, without question, one of the most consequential business figures in Caribbean history. He started with air conditioning units. He built the Sandals Resorts empire, one of the most recognizable luxury resort brands in the world, operating across multiple Caribbean territories, employing tens of thousands of people. He founded the ATL Group, and he founded the Jamaica Observer, the country's second-largest newspaper. By the time of his death in January of 2021, Butch Stewart had accumulated a level of wealth, influence, and political connectivity that had no real parallel in Jamaica. Prime Minister Andrew Holness described him publicly as one of Jamaica's most brilliant business minds. His funeral was attended by the country's most senior political figures. His family was woven into the fabric of Jamaican public life so deeply that the Stewarts were not merely a wealthy family. They were an institution. That context matters enormously for what comes next. In 2017, Bobby Stewart, the eldest son of Butch Stewart, heir to the family's business empire, founded a company. He called it Geophysics Jamaica Limited. He did not register it in Jamaica. He registered it in St. Lucia. He is its sole shareholder. There is no publicly disclosed board of directors. There are no other shareholders on record. One man, one offshore company, and the mandate of that company was to acquire mineral exploration licenses across Jamaica. What happened over the following 7 years is what this documentary is about. Today, Geophysics Jamaica Limited holds over 70 mineral exploration licenses. Those licenses cover 4,000 square kilometers of Jamaican territory. 4,000 square kilometers is approximately 37% of Jamaica's total land area. 37% of an entire country controlled by one man through one private company registered in St. Lucia. And every single one of those licenses was approved under the Jamaica Labour Party government. 4 consecutive ministers signed off. Mike Henry, Robert Montague, Audley Shaw, Floyd Green, 4 different ministers across multiple years, and the licenses kept flowing to the same destination. Pause on that for a moment. If you are a Jamaican living in London, in New York, in Toronto, in Miami, you may have sent money home to family. You may have visited the island. You may have thought about investing one day. You may have felt that deep, complicated love for a place you grew up hearing about or grew up in. And while you were living your life abroad, this was happening. The mineral rights beneath the land your grandparents farmed, beneath the hills your parents grew up in, being quietly accumulated by one man through an offshore company, with the blessing of the government, without a single public conversation about whether any of this served Jamaica's interests. That is the stakes frame for this story, and it only gets more complicated from here. Here is a question that deserves a straight answer. Where did Bobby Stewart's licenses actually come from? Because no mineral exploration license appears from nowhere. It either comes from the government directly, or it is transferred from a previous holder. And the story of how Bobby Stewart built his initial portfolio tells you almost everything you need to know about how this whole system operates. His first 6 licenses, the ones that formed the foundation of everything, came from a company called Karub Copper. Karub Copper. The name means nothing to most people, but look at who founded it and who ran it, and a pattern emerges that is very hard to dismiss. The co-founder of Karub Copper was a man named Jeff Ackert. Jeff Ackert spent 6 years at Barrick Gold. Barrick Gold is a Canadian multinational and, at the time, one of the 2 largest gold mining companies on the planet. It operates in more than a dozen countries. It is one of the most strategically sophisticated resource companies in the world. The chief executive who later ran Karub Copper was Stephen Hughes. Stephen Hughes spent 12 years at the Grasberg mine in Indonesia, a mine operated by Freeport-McMoRan, the American giant and one of the world's largest producers of copper and gold. Let that sit for just a moment. Ackert came from Barrick, Hughes came from Freeport. And what happened to Karub Copper's licenses after Bobby Stewart bought them for $210,000 United States dollars? Barrick Gold received access to 400,000 hectares of Jamaican territory. Freeport-McMoRan committed $75 million United States dollars to explore their share. Say it plainly. Ackert came from Barrick. Hughes came from Freeport. The licenses ended up with Barrick and Freeport. Bobby Stewart became the intermediary. The licenses needed to travel from their initial holders to the world's largest mining companies. And they moved through a Jamaican company, a company with a politically connected Jamaican name on the paperwork, before landing where they were always, perhaps, intended to land. Now, on paper, the $210,000 sale was a legitimate commercial transaction. There is no proven criminal wrongdoing. That needs to be said clearly, and it will not be said again because it should not need to be. But context is everything. And in context, the question reasonable people are entitled to ask is simply this. Was this an ordinary market deal between strangers? Or was it a structured handoff, one where a politically connected Jamaican intermediary played a specific role in moving valuable assets toward their final destination? We are not saying it was the latter. We are saying the facts, assembled together, make the question impossible to avoid. The $210,000 Bobby Stewart paid is worth examining against what those licenses eventually unlocked. Freeport's $75 million commitment alone is 357 times what was paid for the original package. The gap between what was paid and what was received is not a gap. It is a chasm. And after 30 years of this chain, from BHP's first exploration in the 1990s, through a succession of Australian, Canadian, and British companies, through Karub Copper, through Geophysics Jamaica, all the way to Barrick and Freeport, in 2024, what does Jamaica receive? 5%. 5% of any mineral revenue generated from its own earth. Consider how other resource nations have done this. Norway captures approximately 78% of oil revenues through a combination of taxation and state ownership. Botswana negotiated a 50% stake in its diamond wealth and transformed from one of the poorest countries in the world into one of the most stable economies on the continent. Papua New Guinea holds a 30% carried interest in major mining projects. Chile, Peru, and Ghana all operate at substantially higher effective rates than 5%, in exchange for 37% of Jamaica's mineral rights. If you have ever wondered why Jamaica, with all its geological richness, has never fully translated its natural resources into national prosperity, this number is a good place to start looking for answers. Before we go any further, if this is the kind of journalism you think the Caribbean deserves, right now is the time to subscribe to Caribbean Journey. We are building something serious. Verified data, real accountability, stories the mainstream outlets will not touch. We are working towards 10,000 subscribers, people who refuse to look away from the facts. If that sounds like you, subscribe now and hit the bell. Because what comes next, the oil story, is even more extraordinary than what you have just heard. In 2014, Jamaica's Energy Minister Philip Paulwell signed an oil exploration agreement with a company called Tullow Oil. Tullow is an Irish company listed on the London Stock Exchange. At the time of the agreement, it was one of the more active frontier oil explorers in the world, known for working in geologically complex and commercially uncertain territory. The agreement covered the Walton Basin, the offshore territory south of Jamaica where that 7 billion barrel estimate originates. Here is what Paulwell has since admitted publicly in parliamentary statements that are part of the official record. He was simultaneously negotiating with Repsol, the Spanish energy major, one of the largest oil companies in the world by revenue and reserves, a company with the technical capacity and the financial firepower to actually develop what might be beneath those waters. He has admitted that Repsol's terms were, in his own words, significantly more favorable to Jamaica than what Tullow was offering. He chose Tullow anyway. We are not going to speculate about why. The public record does not provide a clear answer, and responsible journalism means acknowledging that limitation. But the outcome of that decision is documented. It is not in dispute. In 2020, Tullow Oil transferred its 80% stake in the Walton Basin license to a company called United Oil and Gas. What is United Oil and Gas? On paper, it is a United Kingdom company, but it was not always called that. When it was incorporated in June of 2015, 1 year after Paulwell signed the Tullow deal, it was called Centara Energy Limited. Then it changed its name to Centara Energy plc. Then it changed again to United Oil and Gas, 3 names in 2 years, for a company that has never drilled a single well anywhere. The transfer from Tullow to United Oil was described in public statements as happening for a nominal fee. Former Tullow employees, now running their own company, received Tullow's most speculative asset, a license over a basin that may hold $742 billion of oil, for essentially nothing. Minister Darrell Vaz subsequently told the Jamaican Parliament that United Oil had invested $39.3 million United States dollars in Jamaica. The company's own audited financial accounts, filed with the UK's Companies House and available as public record, show $7.4 million in capitalized Jamaica assets. The company held approximately $800,000 in cash. It had $1.3 million in unpaid bills tied specifically to its Jamaican operations, 39 million claimed, 7 million documented. The difference between those two numbers is $32 million. And the auditors, the independent professionals legally obligated to give an honest assessment, formally noted in their report that the company faces a material risk of being unable to continue as a going concern. That is not vague language. That is auditor language for this company might collapse. 9 employees, less than a penny per share, auditor warnings in black and white. 39 million claimed versus 7 million documented, unpaid bills, 0 wells drilled. This is the entity Jamaica's government authorized as the exclusive license holder over waters that may contain $742 billion of oil. And Minister Vaz did not merely authorize them on paper. He went further. A photograph was published showing Minister Darrell Vaz aboard a vessel associated with United Oil and Gas. That vessel is the RV Geyer, built in 1973, 53 years old, flagged in Vanuatu, a Pacific island nation located 15,000 miles from Jamaica. When you check the vessel tracking database, the ownership field is blank. The management field is blank. No owner, no manager, flagged on the other side of the world. A 9-person company with a share price of less than 1 penny brought the minister aboard this vessel for photographs. But here is the detail that tells you everything about how this whole ecosystem operates. When the Jamaica Observer published its article about United Oil and Gas, the photograph they used to illustrate the story was not the RV Geyer, the actual vessel the minister visited. The 53-year-old Vanuatu flagged ship with blank ownership fields. They used a photograph of the Polarcus Adira, a 92-meter, state-of-the-art seismic research vessel. A ship with no connection to United Oil's Jamaican operations. A ship that made United Oil look like something it is not. And on the 24th of April 2026, the Polarcus Adira was sold. The buyer? Undisclosed. The price? Undisclosed. This story follows a pattern at every transaction, in every corporate structure, in every piece of media coverage. Obscure the buyer, obscure the owner, register offshore, use an intermediary. Answer the question of who with silence, and the question of what with impressive-sounding numbers. Let us talk about the Jamaica Observer, because the media's role in this story is not a footnote. It is central to how accountability was avoided for as long as it was. The Jamaica Observer was founded by Butch Stewart. After his death, it passed, along with the broader Stewart media interests, into the family's portfolio. Bobby Stewart, the man who controls 37% of Jamaica's mineral rights through Geophysics Jamaica, is the son of the man who built that newspaper. When the Observer published its coverage of Bobby Stewart's mineral license dealings, it did not disclose this connection. It did not tell its readers, the subject of this story is the son of our founder. It reported on the deals. It used the wrong photograph to represent United Oil's vessel. And it left the most important piece of context any reader would need, the family connection, completely undisclosed. This is what conflicts of interest look like in practice. They do not come with announcements. They do not publish editorials saying we are going to soften this story because it involves our proprietor's family. They operate through selection, through framing, through which photograph gets chosen, through which questions simply never get asked. The Jamaica Observer is not a minor outlet. It is one of the country's 2 major newspapers. It shapes public opinion. It determines what Jamaicans at home and in the diaspora consider important and what they do not. When an institution of that size has a structural conflict of interest in covering one of the most consequential mineral rights stories in modern Jamaican history, the damage to public understanding is real and it is lasting. There is also a broader political picture that has to be addressed. Butch Stewart donated $31.5 million Jamaican dollars to every member of parliament in the country. Both parties. Every single MP. It is part of the public record. The donation was framed as charitable, giving support for constituency work. But the effect of that donation, regardless of the intention behind it, is that every sitting member of parliament had a financial relationship with the Stewart family during the same period when the mineral license deals were being approved. 4 ministers signed off. The Stewart family's political relationships extended across both sides of the aisle. This is not evidence of bribery. There is no evidence of criminal wrongdoing. But accountability is not only about criminal wrongdoing. It is about whether the public can have genuine confidence that decisions about their national resources were made purely in their interest, without the influence of concentrated private wealth, political relationships built over decades, and a media ecosystem that had a structural reason not to press too hard. On all 3 of those measures, transparency, media independence, and public confidence, this story leaves serious, documented, and unanswered questions on the table. Step back from the individual details for a moment. Look at the larger shape of what this story reveals. because this is not ultimately just about one family or one minister or one newspaper. It is about a structural problem. The problem of how small nations manage their most valuable assets when the institutions built to protect those assets are too close to the interests they are supposed to regulate. Jamaica has been here before. In the 1950s and 60s, when bauxite was first discovered and mined at scale, the terms Jamaica negotiated were later understood, widely and in retrospect, to have been far too favorable to the foreign mining companies. It took Michael Manley's government in the 1970s to renegotiate those terms, to establish a bauxite levy, to force a greater share of the resource value back to the Jamaican people. Manley understood something that is still true today: a small nation's greatest leverage in any negotiation with a global corporation is the moment before the license is granted. Once the license is signed, once the resource is committed, the leverage disappears. The corporation has what it came for. The country is left with whatever percentage it agreed to up front. In this case, that percentage is 5%. That number needs to be examined against its context, not just against other countries' royalty rates, though those comparisons are damning enough, but against everything surrounding it. The offshore registration, the opaque ownership structures, the 4 ministers approving licenses for the same company across multiple years. The minister photographed aboard a vessel with blank ownership fields, the newspaper that failed to disclose the family connection. When all of those things exist together, the low royalty, the opacity, the political relationships, the media silence, 5% does not look like the outcome of a tough but honest negotiation. It looks like a symptom. The experience of Guyana is worth considering here. When ExxonMobil signed its production sharing agreement with Guyana in 2016, a deal this channel covered in depth in our Oil Money Files series, the terms were also heavily criticized as too generous to the oil company. Guyana received roughly 50% of profit oil, but only after ExxonMobil had fully recovered its costs. Critics called it a sweetheart deal. There were protests, parliamentary debates, investigative journalism that named the terms clearly. And crucially, Guyanese people knew. At home and in the diaspora, they knew what their government had agreed to on their behalf. They could evaluate it, they could organize around it, and as revenues began to flow, the government has moved to renegotiate elements of the arrangement. That is what public accountability makes possible. Even when the deal is imperfect, and every deal is imperfect, transparency at least gives citizens the information they need to push back. In Jamaica, by contrast, how many people living in Kingston today can tell you the royalty rate on their country's mineral resources? How many people in Montego Bay and Spanish Town know that one man controls 37% of their island's mineral rights through a St. Lucia registered company? That is the accountability gap. And it is not filled by governments or newspapers with conflicts of interest. It is filled by citizens who demand better, by diaspora communities who refuse to accept that what happens to their home country is not their concern, by content creators and journalists who choose to do the work that institutional media will not. Jamaica's constitution guarantees its citizens a right to a healthy and productive environment. That is not rhetorical language buried in a preamble. It is a legal commitment, and it raises a question that Jamaican legal scholars and civil society have not yet fully pressed in the public sphere. What does that constitutional right actually mean when applied to the management of the country's natural resources? If you have a constitutional right to a productive environment, does that right include knowing who controls the mineral rights beneath your land? Does it include the right to a transparent process for how those rights are granted? Does it include a royalty structure that returns meaningful value to the public from whom the resources ultimately originate? These are not abstract philosophical questions. They are live legal and political questions that Jamaican citizens and civil society organizations have every standing to pursue. Here is what Jamaican citizens currently know. They know that 37% of their island's mineral rights are controlled by one man through an offshore company. They know that $742 billion of potential oil wealth sits beneath their southern waters, licensed to a company whose own auditors say it may not survive. They know that 4 ministers approved licenses without triggering any meaningful public debate. They know that the country's second-largest newspaper failed to disclose a family connection when covering one of the most significant mineral stories in modern Jamaican history. Here is what they do not know. The full terms of the oil agreement, United Oil's complete license obligations. How much, if anything, Bobby Stewart paid the government beyond the Karub Copper transaction for the right to control 37% of Jamaica's territory, and who ultimately owns the vessel on which their minister was photographed. Every one of those gaps is a gap in accountability. Every one of them represents information that Jamaica's citizens are constitutionally entitled to expect their government to provide clearly and publicly. Pull the camera back even further, and what you see in this story is a pattern that extends well beyond Jamaica. It has played out across the Caribbean, across Africa, across Southeast Asia, across every region where small nations sit on top of large resources and either lack the institutional capacity or, critically, the political will to defend their interests against the concentrated power of global capital. The pattern has recognizable stages, and it is worth naming them clearly. First, exploration. Foreign companies spend years and millions mapping what is underground. They develop detailed knowledge of what is there long before any government or citizen does. The information is asymmetric from the start. The company knows, the public does not. Second, option creation. Licenses are acquired, often at relatively low cost, from governments that may not fully appreciate what they are agreeing to. The license is not valuable because it guarantees a resource. It is valuable because it gives the holder the exclusive right to find it and profit from it. Third, intermediary positioning. A local partner, typically someone with political connections, is inserted into the chain. This satisfies local ownership requirements on paper. It provides political cover, and it creates a layer of domestic legitimacy for a transaction that is ultimately controlled by foreign capital. Fourth, roll-up. The licenses concentrate. One entity ends up with controlling interest over a large area. The price paid at each step is a fraction of the value at the end. Fifth, exit or extraction. The resource is either developed, and the terms agreed in Stage 2 determine what the country receives, or the license package is sold to an even larger player, generating a profit that flows entirely through the intermediary chain, not to the country itself. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is a documented business model, studied by economists at the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and in peer-reviewed academic literature on resource governance. The challenge for small nations is not identifying the pattern. It is building the institutions, the laws, and the political culture to interrupt it before Stage 5 is reached. Jamaica is, at the time of this documentary, somewhere between Stage 3 and Stage 4. The licenses have concentrated. The major mining companies are engaged. The oil license is held. What Jamaica will ultimately receive has not yet been definitively answered because the resources have not yet been fully extracted. That means there is still time. Not much, but some. So what would real accountability actually look like here? What specifically could the Jamaican government, Jamaican media, and the Jamaican people at home and in the diaspora reasonably demand? Start with transparency. Every mineral exploration license currently held by Geophysics Jamaica Limited should be publicly listed. Full terms, fees paid, and the approval process documented in detail. Citizens have a right to know what their government agreed to on their behalf. Then royalty reform. 5% is not a figure most resource economists would defend as adequate for Jamaica's situation, particularly given the scale of the Barrick and Freeport commitments now on the table. The government should commission an independent review of whether Jamaica's current mineral royalty and tax structure serves the public interest benchmarked against comparable nations. That review should be public. Then beneficial ownership transparency. Every company holding a Jamaican mineral license should be required to disclose its ultimate beneficial owners, the real human beings behind any corporate structures, regardless of where those companies are registered. If a company is registered in St. Lucia but its sole shareholder is a Jamaican national, that should be publicly knowable. It should not require investigative journalism to uncover it. Then media disclosure. Any major Jamaican media outlet covering stories in which its ownership has a financial or family interest should be required to state that interest prominently at the top of the coverage. This is standard practice in credible journalism jurisdictions. It should not be optional. And public engagement. Agreements of this magnitude, agreements that bind a nation's mineral rights for decades, should require genuine public consultation before they are finalized. Not a legal notice published once in a gazette. Real documented, citizen-accessible engagement. None of these demands are extreme. None of them would make Jamaica hostile to legitimate investment. They are simply the baseline of what a functioning resource governance system looks like. The question is whether Jamaica's political class has the will to build it, and whether enough Jamaican citizens demand it loudly enough that the answer to that question is not optional. 30 years. That is how long this story took to reach where it stands today. In the early 1990s, BHP, then one of the world's largest mining companies, sent teams to Jamaica to map the geology. They spent years, they spent significant money, they found things, they documented things. And then, as corporate priorities shifted and Jamaica proved too complicated or too small for a company of BHP's scale, they moved on. But the knowledge they generated did not disappear. It passed hand to hand through a chain of Australian, Canadian, and British companies, each adding their own layer of understanding, each refining the picture of what Jamaica actually holds beneath its surface. 30 years of that accumulated knowledge eventually reached the hands of Barrick Gold and Freeport-McMoRan, the two largest gold and copper miners on the planet. It got there through a company registered in St. Lucia that was 7 years old. It was approved by 4 consecutive Jamaican ministers, and it was reported by a newspaper that failed to disclose that the subject of the story was the founder's son. Bobby Stewart, sole shareholder of Geophysics Jamaica, eldest son of the most powerful businessman in Jamaican history, became the central figure in the longest mineral handoff in Jamaica's modern history. He paid $210,000 for his first 6 licenses. Barrick committed to 400,000 hectares. Freeport committed $75 million. Bobby retains 5% of his joint venture with Freeport. Jamaica retains 5% of all mineral revenue. The gap between what was paid at the beginning of this chain and what was received at the end runs into the billions, and at every single step, the mechanism was the same. Obscure the buyer. Register offshore. Use an intermediary. Keep the royalty low. Move quietly. The information required to tell this story was always there, in corporate filings, in parliamentary statements, in license registrations, in vessel tracking databases, in audited accounts submitted to public registries, in photographs published on ministerial social media. It just had not been assembled. Until now. If you stayed with this documentary to the end, then you are exactly the kind of person this channel was built for. You did not look away. You stayed with the facts even when they were uncomfortable. You understand that caring about Jamaica or Guyana or Trinidad or any Caribbean nation means more than pride. It means accountability. It means asking the questions that the powerful would very much prefer you did not ask. Here is what I need you to do, not tomorrow, right now. Leave a comment with one question. Just one. The question this documentary left you with. The thing you still want, answered that this story did not provide. Whether you are in Kingston or London, in Georgetown or Toronto, in Montego Bay or New York, your question belongs in that comment section. Because the more of us asking the same questions, the harder it becomes for those questions to be ignored. Subscribe to Caribbean Journey if you have not already. We are building towards 10,000 subscribers, a community of people who believe the Caribbean deserves journalism that is serious, that uses verified data, and that does not look away when the story gets uncomfortable. Every subscriber sends the algorithm a signal that this kind of content matters. Every subscriber is a vote for what the Caribbean conversation should look like, and share this video. Not because it is entertaining, though I hope it has been, but because the people who need to see it will not necessarily find it on their own. Every Jamaican in the diaspora who watches this is one more voice capable of demanding better. Share it. This has been episode 1 of Who Owns the Caribbean? A series that will take us across the region, from the oil fields of Guyana to the ports of Trinidad, from the mineral mountains of Jamaica to the contested waters of the Eastern Caribbean. Because Jamaica is not an isolated case. The pattern documented in this episode repeats itself, with variations across every island and territory where resources are large and institutions are small. The Caribbean is not poor. It has never been poor. It sits on top of extraordinary wealth. The question this series will keep asking, every episode without exception, is simply this: who owns it? And does that answer actually serve the people it should? I am Caribbean Journey, and we are just getting started.